Hello, everybody. Welcome to everybody's joined us on YouTube and Facebook for this event. We also welcome you if you're looking at the live record, you're looking at the recording later. My name is Will McMahon, and my job is to facilitate the event. We're here for the launch of a new report by Dr. Rex McKenzie of Kingston University titled Tax Haven Money in London's Real Estate. You can download the report from the Action on Empty Homes website. Now, at Action on Empty Homes, we've been focused on how different forms of investment drive emptiness and underutilisation in the housing market in Britain. So we're really pleased to be collaborating with Rex's Wealth Investment Project and the Wealth Chain Project on this work. And we want to thank the Trust for London for supporting our project. We're also really pleased that Rex's research has appeared in The Guardian today. It's got a good piece of coverage from Rupert Neal, who's the Wealth Investment Analyst. And we're also working with the Big Issue magazine to give coverage to the report, the Big Issue being the main magazine that's sold on the streets in aid of homeless people. And they're very interested in what we're talking about. I'd like to introduce our panel members and then give you a bit of background information about the shape of the next hour and how it will go. With us, we have, of course, Dr. Rex McKenzie, Assistant Professor and Senior Researcher, Kingston University. Dr. Manyanka Mukherjee, Research Fellow, London School of Economics and Political Science. Dr. Samuel Stein, Housing Policy Analyst, Community Service Society of New York. And we've invited Sam in particular because there's a lot of comparative work to be done, I think, on London and New York and what's happening in terms of wealth investment. We have Professor Roland Atkinson, Research Chair in Inclusive Societies from the University of Sheffield. And we have Chris Bailey, Campaigns Manager, Action on Empty Homes, and Chris is actually leading on our wealth investment project in London. So how the next hour will go is we'll open with a 20-minute discussion between Rex and Professor Roland Atkinson, just to cover some of the main issues that are in the report, give you some of the juicy bits. We'll then ask our guests, Manyanka, Sam and Chris, if they have any questions for them, questions or clarifications, and hopefully we will then glide seamlessly into a roundtable discussion that will last for about half an hour. If you're watching live and you have any questions, then please put them on Facebook or YouTube, and we'll do our best to put them to the panel members. Now, we're aiming to finish in about an hour and a quarter, so we'll go on for no longer than 4:15 London time. Right, I'm going to stop talking now because we want to get on with proceedings, and I'm going to hand over to Professor Roland Atkinson. Over to you, Roland.
Great, thank you very much, Will, and fantastic to be with everybody here today, and Rex, of course, in particular. I have had the great pleasure of reading fully this report by Rex, so I know what it's about, but a lot of the people watching will not know the broad sort of detail of what's in there. So I was just going to open things up, Rex, by asking you just to give us a bit of a summary of some of the key points that are in this report, which is obviously hugely topical right now.
Sure. Just before I answer you, I just got to say that the report, the research is not just my work. I've had a number of collaborators and very talented young people working with me. Shada Rosina from the University of Leicester, who did the qualitative research. Jonathan Bourne from UCL, who is a data scientist on the project, and my co-collaborator at Kingston, Andrea Ingiani, who did the statistical work. So it's very much a joint effort. It's just, and it's really a collaboration. Okay, so what was the aim and what are the main findings? Well, essentially, the whole project was motivated by Grenfell and the fire at Grenfell Towers. I know that area reasonably well, and I was kind of shocked by the fire because the fire I knew was in close proximity to Kensington and Chelsea, which I had regarded as a really affluent place. So you had this kind of tower of inequality right next to a quite affluent neighborhood, and that kind of intrigued me, and I wanted to explore the relationship between this affluence and what I perceived as being massive inequality. Then I found out that there was a huge amount of tax haven owned residents in the Kensington and Chelsea area. And so from there, the kind of project took shape. What we then started to do was look at the relationship between tax haven ownership in the City of London. So what we found was this. We found an amazing amount of concentration. We found that essentially there were two boroughs and one administrative district in a very small part of London that was just dominated by tax haven owned entities. These were Kensington and Chelsea, Westminster, and both of those we predicted. What we didn't predict was the City of London. The City of London also has an amazing amount of residentially owned homes. And then we found out that there were more tax haven owned properties than had previously been reported. That's because largely there are a number of entries in the land registry data where you've got an address, but then you have multiple properties for that address. What had happened before is that we think this had been missed. So we found out that there were about 44,000 more properties than previously reported, making for a total of roughly 138,000 in England and Wales. What intrigued me particularly was that we found out that the funding for this investment was coming primarily through tax havens, which were in the British Overseas Territories and the British Crown dominions. So this we kind of looked at as some kind of legacy of empire. And that ties up in the literature with a paper by Haberle and Wojcik, who again trace tax havens to a kind of imperial legacy. And then, quite ironically, the impact was felt primarily among those citizens who actually came from these regions and the hard pressed in London. So those were our main findings. Can you hear me?
Sorry. This is a critical element of the report. This is the real dynamite in there, that you've uncovered almost sort of 50% more properties than had previously been identified. And so the geography is interesting, but this technique that you use to go into these records and unpick the extent of investment activity that's kind of concealed offshore, I think is the really fantastically most important thing perhaps about the report. What do you think is driving a lot of that investment decision, this use of offshore entities and sort of investment techniques? What's behind a lot of that activity, would you say?
Well, I would say that, from 2008, we've been in a period of kind of historically low interest rates up until quite recently. And I think that's been a driver among the alternative investment managers who were looking for higher yield, and they couldn't get it from traditional types of investments. So they moved into houses, and I think that's one thing that drives it. But overall, there are inducements to use the offshore. if you are an investor. And the investment, just to give you an example, for instance, there's about capital gains tax is, probably 20 to 40% respectively for individuals and for corporations, 20 to 40%. Okay, so if you can reduce that cost, you are really saving a lot. You're really maximizing your profits. That's an inducement. Also, the tax on rental income of kind of, when you buy property to rent, when you buy to let, there's a tax on rental income of 25%. If you purchase it through the offshore and you structure the deal properly through the offshore, then that too is gone. So I would say that there's an inducement, a very strong inducement for investors to use the offshore. I think too that another driver is actually Brits, who I believe are round tripping and buying second homes in England and Wales. Maybe not necessarily so much in London, but certainly we saw that in Liverpool when we looked at Liverpool. We have reason to believe that this is, British citizens who are using the offshore to buy second homes, perhaps as kind of a nest egg or a pension, who knows, but as a form of augmenting their incomes.
So, I mean, the really critical thing from my side of looking at that, I mean, what you're pointing to is massive losses of public income. If we're talking about the big debates going on at the moment around a wealth tax, how do we recoup and invest in things like public services and so on, and looking at the offshore world right now in the politics of this moment, this all looks pretty rotten. That this is vehicles that allow people to conceal, to reduce their tax burden. And where we sit right now, this looks really particularly problematic. But I don't know how much more you're able to say about who is doing this investing. Do we know whether we're primarily talking about individuals? Are we talking about institutions? What kind of insights, if any, do we have on some of that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, what you're asking there is about the beneficial owners. And that's really difficult to get to. The whole idea of the offshore is to protect the identity of the beneficial owners. So we could only do that, make kind of educated guesses by extrapolation, really, or wait until the ICIJ release one of their data leaks, which gives us a clear idea of who is involved. Well, through the ICIJ, we know that there are a number of kleptocrats that are involved. We know that they're money launderers. And you can just call that criminal money. And that is easy. That is easy. That's in the press. And so, there's not much of a problem there. There is two sociologists coined this term: transmanagerial class and transnational managerial class, transnational capitalist class, Cox and Sclair. So this is what I believe. We have a class of managers. In the report, they are portrayed as non-doms. Non-doms, as you well know, are people domiciled in Britain, but the state allows them to pay no taxes because their skills are needed here. They happen to live in the areas with the highest concentration of offshore housing. So we've kind of put that together, and we suggest that this transnational managerial class is the class indeed which are the individuals who are in part behind the purchases. And then, of course, there are the multinational corporations, the transnational capitalist class. They need the offshore because they have to have a place to book funds. They have to. This is where they carry out their transfer pricing practices through, etc., etc. So, in large part, I would say 3 sources of demand. Your straight up kleptocrat stroke criminal money, your managerial class of non-doms. Incidentally, I think Rishi Sunak's wife was in the paper as a non-dom not too long ago. And a transnational capitalist class made up primarily of companies. That transnational capitalist class, their money seems to flow in from Luxembourg and Ireland, whereas the rest comes in from BVI and the other places that I mentioned earlier.
So we've seen 2022, we've got supposedly this, I think it's the Economic Crimes Act 2022, which is supposed to help us identify beneficial owners, but I don't know if Oliver Bullow's in the audience, but he's been very critical of the weakness of those kind of techniques, those legislative innovations, because there's it's very easy to get around the rules so that you still can't really identify who the beneficial owners are. So something that a lot of people are pointing to within these debates is that the state is very slow, ineffective, or indeed by extension compliant with a lot of what's essentially going on here. So we may not want to necessarily dig into that, or we can dig into that in some of the discussion. But you've set out in the report a kind of macro image of where this investment is going nationally, that it's concentrated in London, that there's this overlay with the non-dom mapping, which has actually been reported by Advani. There was a report this year about the mapping where the non-doms are in London and elsewhere. Moving from that macro image down to the kind of micro level, I know that the report does a lot of focusing on thinking through what the impact of these investments, these flows of offshore capital into a city like London, what's that doing to communities within the city?
Yeah. This is the qualitative side of our work. Can be summed up in one word: gentrification, and all that gentrification implies. So the residents that we spoke to, typically spoke about displacement. There was a sense of alienation. And the reactions were of 2 types. The first type was that, like, let's get out of here. We can't breathe here. We can't live here. It's too expensive. So let's move, and let's move to perhaps one of the outer boroughs where it's a lot cheaper and a lot more livable. So that is probably most people. But then you had a group or groups of citizens who seemed determined not to move and had organized themselves in different ways to actually kind of resist this tendency towards, what they call gentrification. Obviously, the gentrification literature is rich and diverse, but I've just read something recently which suggests it's not gentrification, but akin more to sterilization. That is sanitizing particular neighborhoods. Yeah.
Okay. And so, I mean, to pick up on the gentrification theme, it seems, if we went back to 1960s, 70s, 80s, I'm thinking back to when I was looking at gentrification in London as a doctoral student. This was a very sort of piecemeal process. People like Loretta Lees, of course, have talked about a lot of this stuff. Then we move into a more kind of state coordinated phase. So there's obviously huge amounts of people displaced from public housing estates in the city. So that's coordinated, if you like, by perhaps between a sort of central and local authority level set of actions. And lurking in the background, and something that we've never really discussed within those debates, is potentially the presence of offshore money and its sort of infiltration into a lot of those locations. So that seems to me to open up a very important set of dynamics that have been more or less not ignored, but we haven't had the empirical data to allow us to sort of tap into some of those debates. That seems to me also very, very important. I was going to ask, sort of maybe as a prelude to some of the discussion that we are going to have, is there anything straight off the bat that you might say about what can be done about some of those issues from a kind of community perspective or from the city's perspective, perhaps?
I think part of our intention was to take a first step in that this type of investment is really shrouded in mystery and opacity. So what we wanted to do was to, first of all, but contribute to a conversation, promote a conversation, and disseminate information. Because we have found in speaking to people that they might not exactly know what offshore finance is. They might not exactly know how the thing works, but they are aware of the impact. They are aware of the empty homes in the area, for instance. They're aware of, obviously, prices, rents, etc., etc. Now, what we have seen, and this I think is probably spontaneous on the part, there's a group of citizens in Wandsworth who've organized themselves to actually monitor planning meetings and raise objection where and when necessary. I think that's the kind of thing that can be done by ordinary residents.
That's great.
Yeah,
that's a great start. And back to you then, Will. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I was going to pick up on that because there's lots of different ways, I guess, of approaching this problem. And what I want to do is open up the conversation now to Mayanka and Chris and Sam to see if they have any initial thoughts about role of government, role of community. Who would like to kick off? And if you have any questions, actually, to Rex, a clarification that you think you need, pitch those in as well.
I'm happy to jump in.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much, Rex and Roland, for the discussion. I had a couple of questions. So really briefly, I did my PhD looking at empty houses in Kensington and Chelsea, mainly comparing Cadogan Estates properties. So Cadogan Square, which were kind of luxury homes, several of which were empty, and a nearby council estate called Sutton Estate that was being decanted at the same time. So kind of to Rex's point around how these forces affect each other in an area. So some of the things that I found, which kind of bring me to my questions. One is, speaking to residents, they really distinguished between different types of empty houses, and not all were seen as problematic. And there was a sense of legitimacy of some houses that was derived through various factors. So for example, seasonal residents or people who would come in punctually were more accepted and talked about in a less problematic manner than those who were seen as erratic. And of course, there was kind of racial, cultural elements to who was seen as fitting in. And I found that interesting around moral economies that people draw in these areas, which have a big presence of empty homes. So that was one point. And the other thing was to ask if your report or kind of this project could shine some light on families like Cadogan family or the Grosvenors, or I looked at the Cadogan estate, and people who kind of pose themselves as these custodians, these who own a lot of the freeholds in the area and ultimately do benefit from these emptinesses, even though there's this public dialogue around wanting to protect the community and save the community from emptiness. These landowners, in fact, facilitate and allow for the emptiness to occur. They send newsletters to their overseas homeowners. There were these kind of Australian residents I spoke to who every month received newsletters about their properties in London. So it was actually quite a well-oiled system rather than seen as disruptive. Or some of the architects I spoke about, it's actually much easier to do repairs and maintain the value of the property when houses are empty punctually. And so, yeah, that was kind of more around what happens when we see these things as actually quite embedded and well legitimized within the ecosystem. So in Kensington and Chelsea, many of the shops, for example, operate on this idea that people don't live there all the time, which is why a lot of the local bookshops, for example, are closing down. But there are lots of shops that operate on a VIP sales model, which is a different form of retail, not based on always being open. There were gun shops nearby that I interviewed where people would hold guns for gun owners while they were away, because it's hard to store guns in an empty house without a proper gun cabinet. So again, just kind of thinking about all of these practices that actually make emptiness extremely functioning, and kind of perceived differently when we look at how it is embedded within the fabric of a borough like Kensington and Chelsea, which you rightly pointed out is a borough that really embodies that kind of extreme polarization. Sorry, those were just some jumbled up thoughts. And thank you so much for the report and the discussion.
Yeah, we did another study on Liverpool where we looked at the Grosvenor family, and what they owned, how long they'd owned it for, and their kind of mechanisms for keeping wealth within the family, so to speak. But in this particular study, we really didn't concentrate on owner/investors. We concentrated on the community and the impact on the community, and to some extent on local councillors, because that was the kind of dynamic we wanted to capture. A part of what's motivated the study. I am an economist by training, but I've read a lot of sociology as well. So back in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, Ray Powell asked the question, whose city? And this is really the question. Who does this city of ours, well, I say ours, but who does this city belong to? My answer would be is that it does not belong to the residents. It belongs to business forces.
Okay. Can I bring in either Chris or Sam at this point? Do you have a question or a thought?
Sure, I'll speak up just to say, first, congrats to Rex on this excellent report. And then to make the point that Will made earlier, that I'm coming from New York City, and we have a lot of the same dynamics. I would love to see a report of this degree of rigor on the problem of absentee investor real estate in New York. We had an ICIJ report a few years ago that suggested that about 30% of condominium sales in Manhattan were to these sort of tax avoiding firms, but there's a lot more work to be done. There was resonance also in your discussion about state complicity. We have limited liability corporations in our state that are allowed by the state and that grant virtual anonymity to real estate actors, which totally mystifies who owns what in New York, which is a major problem for the housing and tenant movement. It can't figure out exactly who their landlord is. It can't join with other groups who have the same landlord, but they have a different limited liability corporation owning their building. It's a problem for workers who are basically trying to figure out, they work for a contractor, but who employs the contractor? Some limited liability corporation, but it turns out to be actually a much larger firm that is sort of skirting their labor commitments. So this is a major problem for New York, as is the problem of vacancy. We have very, very, very low vacancy in low-cost apartments and very high vacancy in high-cost apartments, some of which are on the market, but nobody wants them. And then others are being held as investors. Something like 130,000 units are owned but unoccupied and not for sale in New York City right now. So all of this has tremendous resonance. One question that I had is a theme that I think I was hearing, but I just wanted clarified, which is the sort of two-sidedness of tax avoidance. There is money that is earned and you're avoiding paying taxes on that wealth, and then invested into real estate and avoiding paying taxes on the housing. So it's sort of a double theft from the public, possibly the public of two different countries, if the money was earned elsewhere and then invested in the UK. So if I'm hearing that right, I'd love that confirmed. And if so, if you can explain exactly how that works.
Yeah. So on the one hand, you have got companies. Let's try and be more specific. Say landlords, global landlords, who are operating in, many different jurisdictions, and unless it's somebody like the ICIJ or somebody who does a network analysis, it's very difficult to figure out what the connections are. But what we do know is that they're using multiple jurisdictions. There's no telling where the money actually originates, but the whole point is to make sure that we can't put a finger on where taxes should or should not be paid. Mm-hmm. So the whole thing, on the one hand, is just about minimizing our costs, or minimizing costs through tax avoidance. The alternate side of that, and I don't want to make too big a deal about this, is kind of the criminal chains. I don't want to make on kleptocratic chains, because my sense of what is going on, although it's reported in the press generally as kind of a criminal undertaking, is that there are many, many, many globally affluent, call them the middle class, who are also involved in these practices. So it is double-sided. The bottom line is people are, the public purse is that burden of taxation, if you like, is shifted onto others who don't have the means to use the offshore. So in that sense, it's kind of a theft from the public purse.
Mm-hmm. I'm kind of interested, Rex, in what you were saying about, the middle classes and people who, not global investors, corporate investors. So from what you're saying, my assumption is that through the letters that people get through the letterboxes, through marketing across the world, people are being drawn into this kind of investment. Would that be right? And that they form a substantial part of what's going on here?
I believe that to be the case, especially in secondary cities like Liverpool. We didn't find that kind of evidence in London, but I can say in Liverpool, we found evidence which suggested this.
Okay.
We haven't done work on other cities, but yeah, we found that more and more, it was not just this kind of solid group of corporates, etc., that it was ordinary middle-class people who maybe had a bit more money than others. The one thing I will say is this. The BRIC countries, well, no, I wouldn't extend it to the BRIC countries, but China and India play very big roles in this type of investment because of the growth of a middle class, of an affluent middle class, in the last 10, 15, 20 years. So we're seeing a lot of that kind of investment coming from China, through Hong Kong, through the British Virgin Islands, and into London. But this is nothing to do with criminals. This is nothing to do with money laundering. This is just, I imagine, people looking to build up a nest egg for their retirements, etc., etc.
Okay. And there's just because you're kind of, we've just been having a discussion about actually these people are quite hard to get hold of. Yeah, these networks are quite hard to get hold of. And we've got a question in from, I think it's Rihanna Hughes, whose question, she says, are there any positive, is there a positive role that the land registry in the UK could play in this?
You know, the Economic Crimes Act delineates the role that the land registry would play, and it's all about getting us more accurate data. It's all about capturing the data. What we found in working with the land registry data set is that it was really hard to work with, missing entries, etc., etc. So what I've noted in the Economic Crimes Act is that there is provision to check details, to share information with other agencies, and so forth and so on. In that sense, I would say the Economic Crimes Act is an advance and a good one. However, my reservation is whether or not the legal machinery would actually work. In fact, put it another way, whether or not the laws will be implemented, because I think that there's a lot of complicity in between, the powers that be and the tax haven. In other words, we have seen enough newspaper reports, enough leaks to suggest that our political class and our upper classes are deeply involved in holding wealth in offshore jurisdictions.
I tell you, on that point, I'm gonna bring in Chris, who basically does our campaigning on this and has been campaigning on wealth investment in London. Chris, what do you think government could do? Do you think there's a blockage? Do you think that there's too much collusion? If you could bring yourself off mute, that would be great.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a number of reasons that we're interested in this, and certainly in terms of new development, one of the things we're interested in is the way that building for a sort of global investor class changes what you build. I mean, I was literally talking to an architect last week who was explaining how they'd proposed a project, and they'd been told that their proposal was sort of inappropriate because it had too many doors to the street. What they were looking for was a concierge project, because it was acknowledged that the majority of the owners were not going to be there most of the time, and therefore the building had to be managed through a concierge system. So it's interesting to us in the way it changes what's built and how it builds more inappropriate property that's less amenable to being used in a normal primary residential way. One of the things that struck me also about the report, of course, was that it's a very small network of very specific UK-linked tax havens that are responsible for so much of this investment, and that kind of specific character of that, which I know is explored a little bit more in terms of its social impact in the second part of the report. So that's why I just wondered if you had any more sort of thoughts about the way those tax havens are so closely linked to the areas where their holdings are, because I mean, certainly as someone who spent quite a long time working in West London myself, that feels very familiar to me.
Just before you answer that, Rex, we've just been joined by the Bermuda Broadcasting Company, who are clearly interested in what you have to say. Over to you, Rex.
Yeah, not sure how to answer that at all, Chris. The only thing I can say on that is to reiterate the point that I've already made, that these are, the Isle of Man, Jersey, Guernsey. These are really closely associated with Britain and have been historically very, very close. And what I think we see is Brits using these particular offshores to transact business. And also, if you read Palan Moema, then you see that each of those particular offshores is supposed to have a speciality. So all of them specialize in real estate, for instance. But say the Isle of Man actually service the reinsurance company. So as the Bermuda broadcasting people have just joined us, Isle of Man would service the Bermuda reinsurance companies, and so forth and so on. So you can put it together, but it's a lot by inference and correlation. What we have by way of hard data ties jurisdiction to places in London and to communities. And that's what we kind of concentrated on.
Mm. So do we, because we're coming to the last kind of third of the event now, and just kind of, I want to push you on a bit to the question of what can we do about this? Yeah. How can we bring under control these forces? Are we in a situation where we go, don't know, or do we think there are things that we can do? Do we think there are people who can mobilize?
From my point of view, a first step has been taken, and that's data.
Mm-hmm.
We need information and we need data. And up until now, we have not had it. If they follow through, then the land registry would be bringing us a lot more credible data. Up until this point, I think why researchers have not looked at the area seriously is because data has been very hard to find, to work with. So I think a very, very first step would be to get data, to get information, and to kind of remove the kind of layers of secrecy so that we could begin to have an idea of what we're talking about and dealing with. I know that's my opinion. I don't know how everybody else feels.
What do other people feel about that? Is data the first step?
I was just hearing Rex talk about this, and I think the data does two things. One is it enables people to research the phenomenon, but the other is if the data is there, then the secrecy is lessened, and therefore the utility of the tax haven is decreased. So the data release is more than just a research tool. It's also a first step at decreasing the viability of this project.
Any other thoughts on data?
Just a quick thought. Just a quick thought around, I think also around the broader opacity of the housing space in London. I mean, even when it comes to kind of social housing and various different strands of management and housing association, and the relationship between public and private is extremely murky, which of course prevents a lot of the, kind of communities and tenants coming together to, kind of fight for rights, becomes really complicated in this really convoluted landscape. So I suppose there's also data, and there's also kind of importance of kind of clear data, and then data with kind of the purpose of empowering those who are kind of, losing out. So I suppose data is of course not neutral. So I do think there's a lot to think about ways of data collection. Who are we speaking to when we're collecting this data? And how is that data being used to kind of quite consciously engage in this project of clarification in a kind of a political sense as well?
Yeah.
I mean, I would go on.
Go
Sorry.
I'll go around.
I think the data issue is really critical. I remember talking to Guy Shrubsole, who wrote the book "Who Owns England," and they had enormous difficulty assembling a map of England that told people who owned what. I mean, all of this is coming back on the back of rounds of privatization of public data. A real reticence to let this information out into the public domain, and I think that there's nothing coincidental about that. We're beginning, reports like this, and there's a kind of crescendo of activity, I think, that's going on, that's throwing more and more light on this stuff. But the thing that it's throwing more light on is this kind of iceberg wealth economy that this nation actually is. And these tax havens are part of this kind of subterranean form of activity that we're not really supposed to know about. And we're beginning to throw more light on it. And this report is another example of creatively using data. I mean, the machine reading technique that is in the report that Rex has led has allowed already existing publicly data to be properly extrapolated and unpacked in a way that hey, here's the data, but it required real sophistication in the methodology to disassemble that. So I think the question, if you're going to move forward on a public finance agenda here, then the advantages of something like a land valuation tax, for example, requires you to know who owns what. So all of these systems in terms of the opacity, the lack of access, the cost barriers that are put in place. I can't remember what it is, £3 or so for a land registry record. So I got into an exchange with Guy Shrubsole, and he said, look, once you tot up how many records you would need to do the full thing. So here's the question, and why, this is our data, it's people's data, it's this nation's data, and why is that not simply passed over to academics and other investigative journalists to actually really put the picture together? And of course, I think that begins to point to an answer that many writers are coming to the conclusion that the system is set up in this way for very clear reasons. It's not necessarily to protect criminals, but it's certainly to protect the beneficiaries of these systems. Many of them are wealthy nationals or non-doms in this country who, if we simply revealed all this stuff, there would be some significant embarrassment, I think. So I don't really think we're going to see massive traction on this, but Keir Starmer's being pushed to do what's he going to do about a wealth tax? The non-dom classification, is there going to be mobility on that one? Mm-hmm. I know I'm kind of talking too long, but I think the other thing just to quickly nail down here is that it's going to get interesting, because from the political right as well as the left, on the left it's about social justice. Where are we going to get this money from? Who should be fairly contributing? Who's got the broadest shoulders? From the right, there's a fiscal crisis, so there's another push to do things about things possibly like offshore, because otherwise, where are you going to get the money from? So interesting things could happen. Interesting new innovations could arise as a result of work of this kind. So I think things could get quite exciting.
Yeah, and also what we've noticed as well is in terms of people you might think as traditional conservative or liberal Democrat voters in the richer areas, they're getting pretty concerned about what's happening with housing in their area in terms of investment, purchase, squeezing their traditional communities out, and they're very interested as well. I mean, just a couple of questions from different points of view here that we've had in. Tracy from Toxteth, she's given us a number of comments, and I think I can sum them up by saying, do we think there's a relationship between local council officials and developers and wealth investment that is unhealthy?
I think I know why Tracy would ask that question. Did you say she was from Toxteth?
Yeah.
Okay, so Liverpool has its own specific history with councillors and developers, etc. So I get where she's coming from. I think the leader of the council there was arrested and charged for dodgy dealings with developers. A part of the report about London, Tracy, the short answer to your question is yes. A part of the report deals with revolving doors between local council officials and the property industry. So you would find a local council official who would leave the council and then join some property concern or be a consultant to property interests. So what you've got is this kind of revolving doors where you kind of work in the local council first, and then after you work in the local council, you then become a consultant for some developer, or you then go and argue the case, or you give people ideas on how to argue the case in front of the various planning bodies. So yeah, short answer is yes, I think so.
Okay, and then in terms of this kind of thought about people's ability to challenge, I've got a question from Solmaz Tasanoglu, who says, is there any evidence of the impacts on rural and developing areas? Says, I was recently informed that there is a new build in Wimborne in Dorset that is simply being marketed in Southeast Asia. So did you come across any evidence, Rex, or has anybody else come across evidence of this kind of development outside of urban areas?
I can't speak to that. I possibly think Roland might be able to speak to that a bit more than I will. I can't speak to that at all.
Yeah,
I'm not sure I can answer that directly, but I know that, you know, Sadiq Khan was pretty exercised about stuff being advertised in the past in places like Hong Kong that was not being advertised to locals, albeit it was all very expensive stuff. But I don't know. I mean, what you can say is, regardless of whether there are closed boxes of advertising activity going on, obviously the price levels, the price points of a lot of this stuff mean that you are dealing necessarily with a super prime global market, Savills and others, Knight Frank, etc. That's a global circuit of advertising activity that is not, it's not just restricted to the Financial Times, but there's a global layer of people who are looking for opportunities of that kind who may be being advertised to. Whether people are being excluded by that activity, I don't know. Or, Wimborne, yes, I'm sure I've seen examples in places like the south of Devon and so on like that. But beyond that, I don't know.
Okay. There's Charles from Brighton has come in and said, well, we know about dealings, or we're concerned about dealings between developers and the local authority, the local plan authority in Brighton. There seems to be people who are concerned about this inability to get to grips with what's happening in planning and wealth investment and how it's changing their communities. I mean, one question I think is that I kind of want to push us rigorously onto is solutions. Is what can we do about this? What can communities do about it? What can we ask government to do about it? Because otherwise, if we don't have policy solutions, it's going to be pretty hard.
I personally think that there needs to be a tax on owners. I think there needs to be a tax that's meaningful on owners. I think there needs to be some kind of charge for homes that are vacant for X amount of time in the year. A meaningful charge. What we have at the moment are charges or costs, charges which are not meaningful when you consider the types of monies that these investors are dealing with. So I would, given, in fact, I would back the economics crimes bill to close some of the exits that are presently available. Not all, but I think that there ought to be some closure of those loopholes which are out there. I know there's tremendous opposition. Roland mentioned Oliver, but I believe we can kind of close these gaps if we, and we can't leave it to government. I think we've got to apply pressure for that to be done, because I'm a little bit cynical. I don't think without pressure that it will be done.
Okay. Any other thoughts from our participants of what we could do? Chris, what do you think we should be doing?
Well, I suppose one of the things that's always interested me about taxation is, of course, the issue of beneficial ownership, and there's a gradual movement towards, beneficial ownership registers for British property have been promised many times by many governments, going back to David Cameron's administration, and only really the war in Ukraine has started moving us along this path, when suddenly the Conservative Party has decided that some of its Russian friends are perhaps not as friendly as they thought they were, and wanted to exercise sanctions against them at an individual level, which has really spurred quite a significant movement in this area. Because, I mean, several years ago, we looked at the comparison with bits of Canada and Vancouver and British Columbia. And of course, it's so much easier for them to exercise tax on vacant property there, because taxation of property is unified around personal taxation. So you automatically can tax the person in relation to their property wealth. And of course, tax havens are all about that not being possible. They're like an insurance against future taxation of this nature, I suppose. So the move towards beneficial ownership and towards exposing them is a slow move in the direction of making that possible. Any comments on that are welcome, obviously.
Okay. I've had a question in from Jack, who is saying, clearly the past and present of colonialism is shaping the geography of tax haven investment. Any thoughts on this and maybe how it guides our solutions? Rex, can I bring you in on that?
Well, yeah, it certainly is. I mean, it certainly is guiding the geography of tax haven investment. We've seen that. We gave evidence of that in the report, and that's certainly the case. I think there's another layer to this, which is to do with, if you like, our imperial past. And I think that is another area of investigation about how that past is actually shaping our present and our future. Now, I haven't done any work in that area, but I certainly see it in tax haven investment with the project that I've been working on. I definitely see it. I see where the money is coming from. I see where the money is going to, and I could draw some tentative conclusions about it. But I think, really, I mean, this is not just tax havens. This is how our imperial past is affecting our present, and it may even extend to the dreaded Brexit as well. I mean, I think ideas have been shaped by the history, and they've led us in a particular area. However, I don't have a lot of detail to offer on that.
How, just thinking about that, Rex, how far are kind of black and brown communities in London impacted by this kind of investment? Is there a connection there or no?
Well, if you take the center of the city and inquire who lived there originally, the ONS now tell us that the group that lives there is a group that they have categorized as cosmopolitans. And ethnicity central, which is how the ONS classify this group, ethnicity central has moved to the outer boroughs. So there is a suggestion. You can see the kind of migration from the center to the outer boroughs. So there is a suggestion that, this kind of offshore investment is actually bringing about demographic change and the kind of migration pattern where people are pushed outwards to the outer boroughs. Now, the thing about, one of the questions that is always asked is this kind of the capture of the city by a wealthy elite? And my way of answering that, I think, it is part of a much wider process which relates to the capture, if you like, of a political space, an ideological space. And that's largely associated with neoliberalism and what has happened to various groups as a result of neoliberalism. So my sense is, and one thing is clear, among the groups themselves, there's very, very little trust in their representatives. Yeah, so that's the best answer I can give you on that.
I'm just wondering, Sam, is there a comparison to be made in New York there? Has that kind of pattern emerged or not?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we've seen displacement toward the outer boroughs of New York City as the center of Manhattan becomes not only wealthier, but a center for tax haven real estate deals. There is a difference between the condo and rental market and all the rest, but certainly we've seen that pattern emerge. Also, in terms of doing something about it, we have calls for a kind of vacancy tax like Rex is talking about, that there are challenges to that. We have proposals for land value taxes that would get at some of this as well, for more monitoring. But we don't really have a government that wants to take this on, because it's more that, as much as they hate to see the tax revenue not coming in, being a vehicle for major large-scale investment is part of their vision of the successful city. And so there's a political and ideological struggle to be had before we can even get to the point where we're identifying and taxing all this wealth. And also, I think we have the same issue in the US, where people assume that a lot of this tax haven investment is originating out of the country, when in fact a lot of it is locals using tax havens to buy, investment properties in the country where they live. As we say, that the call is coming from inside the house. And sometimes that makes it even more unlikely that the state is going to be, wanting to go after them in the way that they need to. So we really need a movement, an ideological shift, and a political shift to even begin to do the kinds of political action that will stop this.
Mayank, I can see you nodding there. Do you just a couple of things on the ideological shift, or what kind of political movement we need, but also on, did you pick up anything up in your research about ethnicity and the impact of wealth investment on where people are living?
I was nodding kind of regarding the ideological shift, because it is true. I mean, I think even while talking about, how we're classifying all of this, there are certain kind of ideological things that underlie those forms of classification, which is why it becomes really important to kind of think about different ways in which we look at these properties. And I think I was kind of also thinking from my own research is that, there's taxation on one side, but there are also all of these other infrastructures and businesses that uphold empty houses and enable them to exist. I mean, only now every winter there's winterproofing of empty properties, which is particularly, kind of significant right now as we all go through kind of, very challenging winter with, energy crisis and cost of living crisis, and people are thinking about how to keep themselves warm. Whereas a lot of empty houses in Kensington and Chelsea will have, kind of a running heating system while nobody lives there. So I think there are all these questions around looking at questions of not just the existence of these properties, but also their kind of continual management that, kind of enables them to be and to thrive. Because of course, even if we kind of think of them as problematic, there is an interest in allowing their values to stay the same or kind of increase. So I think there's a very complicated relationship between kind of emptiness and this kind of question of value, and then community and care, and how they fit in. So I suppose, it's kind of, to me, requires a kind of large, kind of holistic view around how these properties are, how they're maintained.
Yeah, you bring a really interesting aspect to the discussion, actually, which I kind of hadn't thought of previously about that. And what's because often it's kind of, one has thought of, we live in ghost areas, where nobody lives. So you pick those. Did you pick those ghost areas up?
Yeah, so Cadogan Square was called the Ghost Square when I kind of went in, and I think my project was slightly around looking at, who is not seen as a ghost, or when do we think the ghosts appear, which is why I got into kind of more of this, what are the moralizing languages, which is precisely where some of these kind of questions on ethnicity or acceptable versus non-acceptable owners come in. And my project ultimately almost became a study of Englishness and, which are the communities that could adhere to Englishness, because when I asked neighbors, how do you know there's an empty house? Of course, some of them would say it's dark or there's no light, but some of them started saying, oh, there's no Christmas lighting, which is, again, a very specific way of denoting your presence and performing your presence, not simply being there or physically being there, but being there appropriately. So I suppose, that's kind of an anthropological way of seeing, and maybe kind of complicating the project a bit in terms of data collection, because it's almost questioning what it is that we're even seeing as important data.
Yeah, really interesting. Rex, have you... Actually, no, I'll come to Roland, actually, because we're getting pretty close to the end of our time. Roland, do you have any kind of thoughts, having heard the conversation?
Well, I think the first observation is it's important to acknowledge the level of social anger on these issues that is rising up, the really palpable sense of injustice. And when it comes down to people being able to eat or not, or heat their homes, it's very important that we don't underestimate that. I mean, what this report is sort of chipping into is the increasing public awareness of the extremity of asset inequalities in this and other societies. So people who are homeowners, or people who are investors, people whose pension companies are investing, that's one side of a lot of those people are doing okay, more or less, essentially. Offshore, second homes, Airbnbs, private equity investment, all of this gentrification, from whatever source, is all part of the bigger picture here. Now, you asked what could be done, and I think so far our discussion, to anyone who's in the community sort of affected by those issues, it probably won't be, we're not giving them a magic bullet in that sense. But I was rereading Sam's book, Capital City, recently, and Sam talks about, where is the front line? The front line moves from people in factories campaigning against owners and so on, and it's about dealing with evictions, it's about dealing with gentrification, it's about local housing. Housing is at the center, or housing is, in some diffuse sense, the front line of where we need to be exerting action. Now, of course, if we're talking about things like the offshore and the government's role and so on, which room do you go to? Which committee do you sit in on? Or who do you lobby to do something about this? That's really quite challenging. So I had two sort of thoughts on some of this stuff. Well, first one is that the government should bring in the big four, big five accountancy firms to advise them on how to clamp down on forms of offshore and other forms of tax evasion, tax avoidance, that you go to the devil and bring them into because we know about the sort of revolving doors between government and the accountancy firm. So let's bring them in and get some good advice from the people who are at the forefront of this stuff, okay? The second one is that, and as I'm referring to Rex on this, but is the OCOD database that you used, is that technically free? In other words, could local communities do a quick search to see if their street or their neighborhood is in there, or what's in there, and thereby begin to sort of set in train a process which is essentially about shaming or stigmatizing or getting a debate going about how you would say, we don't want your money in this local authority, and we're going to try and find out, we're going to try and find out who you are. We're going to do some homework ourselves to find out who these beneficial owners are, because this kind of stuff is destructive. It's productive of empty or underused space at a time of intense housing crisis, and we need to be doing something about that. So that was my, at the community level and at the central government level, two thoughts about something that we might actively progress on this stuff.
Very interesting. Just for the unknown, the OCOD database, Rex, is?
That's the database that we use, Land Registry's database. Now, one of the advances that one of our objectives was to make the data more accessible. And we've been able to do that. And we've made it open source, so anybody could get hold of this data and could use this data through our own enhanced OCCA data set. So yeah, we've kind of addressed that. That was one of our aims, to get data into the public domain that people could use to do their own research. And yeah, we've done that.
Okay, that's really, it's interesting because Chris is leading the kind of work that we're doing on wealth investment, and you're building relationships with local community organizations, Chris. I'm just wondering whether it's possible we could actually start that or think about testing that process out.
No, I mean, that's certainly something that, you know, a lot of local organizations have already drawn attention to. You know, I mean, you know, to take a sort of cause celeb, you know, the 35% campaign were pointing out that most of the companies involved in the redevelopment of Elephant and Castle were actually offshore owned vehicles, so they were going to pay no UK tax. I mean, that's a lot of that's commercial property, but a lot of it's residential too. So, I mean, I think there are two, yeah, I mean, there are two sets of questions to ask. There are questions to ask about specific personal investment, and there are questions to ask about the way we allow corporate entities to utilize tax havens beneficially.
Okay. And Roland, you were referring to Sam's book. Sam, what can we, without well, I'll put it like this, what can we learn? What we can learn from what you've studied about how to bring this to the top of the agenda?
Well, I mean, I think what I tried to do was show the quantity of money moving into real estate and why, and to show the political mechanisms that enable it, specifically through urban planning. So I think the first thing that my work says about this is that it's no accident. It's no accident in terms of macroeconomic forces, and it's also no accident in terms of local political conditions. So getting back to what I was saying earlier, we really need to change local political conditions if we expect the state to behave differently. You know, I like Roland's idea of bringing in the big accounting firms. I believe that the state we have right now, at least locally, has no interest in doing such a thing, even though I believe those accounting firms would be extremely useful in tracking down these numbers. So I think it all flows from grassroots political organizing up to changes into the state, up to changes in the political economy.
Yeah. My experience of working across other fields is that you also need to look for the renegades. Yeah, the people who've spent their lives working in those fields and have suddenly gone, oh, I'm not sure I was doing the right thing, and I want to help people now actually deal with what the kind of stuff I was doing when I was in work. And I think they're really important people, and you can only reach them by broadcasting your campaigns to reach them, really, and they will come forward if they see something viable. They will come forward. You know, and that's probably another tactic as well. Any final thoughts from anyone other than Rex, who I'm going to come to last? Anybody else got anything? Mayanka, Chris, Sam, Roland? Well, Rex, what are your final thoughts before I wrap us up?
I think we've got a very important area that's hidden in plain sight. And I think that what I would like to be associated with is stripping away the layers of complexity, opacity, so that we get a clearer view. And we could then begin to take the kind of steps that Roland, Sam, and other people are talking about. I think that would be my kind of big idea and final thought on it. Yeah.
I know. I think that's a good way forward. And I think we've found some ways forward here, actually, which is really, really good. It's a fantastic report. It's available on Action on Empty Homes website. I really would encourage those people watching, and we've got quite a few people watching, to go and find it. We'll be producing a summary so we can share it and share the summary and make it as accessible as possible. I am afraid I've got to bring the discussion to a close now, and I really want to thank Rex, Roland, Mayanka, Sam, and Chris for their contributions today. It's been really, really fascinating, and I've learned a lot, I think. Do download the report, everybody. Thanks to our presenters, thanks to the audience, and thanks for watching, and I'll say goodbye. Goodbye, everybody.